Take a look at this. A tiny red rock alone in the middle of the North Sea. Not a country. Not even attached to the country it belongs to. Just a triangle of crimson sandstone, less than 2 square kilometers, where the waves never stop crashing against cliffs 200 million years old. From far away, it looks like nothing. A holiday spot, a bird sanctuary. But if you zoom in just a little closer, you start noticing things that don't quite belong. A massive crater on the southern tip, way too perfect to be natural. Concrete piers jutting out into the sea, half finished, as if someone gave up halfway through. Bomb craters scattered across the middle of the island. And the highest point of the whole place, 61 meters above the sea, only exists because an explosion threw the ground up there. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. When I first found this island on a map, I felt something I didn't expect. It wasn't curiosity. It was sadness. Because once you know what happened on this little red rock, you can't unsee it. This place has been fought over, traded away, bombed flat, and abandoned more times than almost anywhere on Earth. And yet, somehow, the people who call it home keep coming back. They always come back. This is Helgoland, and this is the story of an island that simply refused to die. For 1,000 years, almost nothing happened here. Frisian fishermen lived on the rock. They prayed to a god called Fosite, who lived in a spring that bubbled up from the cliffs. They spoke a dialect almost no one else in the world understood. Storms came, the island shrank. The natural arch that once connected the two islands collapsed in a storm in 1720, and the islanders thought the world was ending. But the world didn't end, it just left them alone. And being left alone, on a rock in the middle of the sea, was the closest thing to peace those people would ever know. Then in 1807, Britain came. Napoleon had locked Europe shut, and Britain needed a back door. They looked at the map and saw this tiny Danish rock, sitting right next to every German port that had been forced to slam its doors. The Royal Navy sailed up one September morning and just took it. For 7 years, this rock became the smuggling capital of the world. 86 million pounds worth of goods passed through here in 3 years alone. German merchants rowed out in the dark and rowed back before dawn. And when the war ended, Britain quietly kept it, their smallest colony. A red rock in the middle of nowhere that nobody in London really thought about. But the islanders noticed something. Their new British rulers didn't really care what happened here. No taxes, no secret police. And for the first time in centuries, this lonely rock became a place where people could just breathe. Free, the kind of free almost no one in Europe was in those years. Word got out. In 1826, the island opened as a seaside resort, and the Germans came. Not soldiers. Poets, painters, revolutionaries running from their own governments. Heinrich Heine wrote some of his most beautiful work, staring out at these red cliffs. And then, in the summer of 1841, a banished Prussian professor called August Heinrich Hoffmann von Fallersleben arrived. His career had been destroyed. He'd written poems demanding a free Germany, and Prussia had thrown him out. He came here broken. He sat on these cliffs. He looked out at a sea that didn't belong to any king. And on the 26th of August, 1841, on this little British rock, he wrote the words that one day would become the national anthem of Germany. Just sit with that for a second. The national anthem of Germany was written on British soil by a German exile, because this was the only place in the world where he was allowed to dream. A man called Heinrich Goethe arrived around the same time, fell in love with the place, and never left. For 60 years, he sat on these cliffs and watched the birds, and quietly invented an entire branch of science. The first bird observatory in the world, built on this rock, by a man who simply loved the place too much to leave. And then, in 1890, in an office in Berlin, 2 men who had never set foot on Helgoland decided to trade it away. Britain gave Germany the island. Germany gave Britain Zanzibar. The islanders were never asked. One morning they woke up British. The next morning they woke up German. The flag changed. The schoolbooks changed. And the soldiers arrived. And they kept arriving. Because the new German Empire had looked at this peaceful little rock and decided it would make a perfect fortress. Everything beautiful about Helgoland began to die that day. By 1914, when the First World War broke out, every single islander was evacuated. Their homes were stripped. Their lives were boxed up and shipped to the mainland. And just off these red cliffs, the first major naval battle of the entire war was fought, and hundreds of young German sailors died in the same water their grandfathers had fished. The islanders came home in 1918 to find their houses looted. They rebuilt. Of course they rebuilt. What else were they going to do? And then it happened again. The Nazis came. They built bunkers. They dug tunnels. They poured concrete into the cliffs until the whole island was honeycombed from underneath. They had a plan to make Helgoland into something bigger than Britain's own naval base. They never finished it. And on the 18th of April 1945, 3 weeks before the war ended, almost 1,000 British bombers flew over this island and dropped everything they had. The islanders were already underground, in the bunkers their occupiers had forced them to build. They survived. Of course they survived. The Helgolanders always survived. But when they came back up into the daylight, their town was gone. Every house, every church, every fishing shack their grandfathers had built with their own hands. Gone. A few days later, the British took them off the island, told them it was temporary. And then, exactly 2 years to the day after that bombing, on the 18th of April 1947, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Royal Navy did something nobody on Earth had ever done before. They piled up 4,000 torpedo heads, 9,000 depth charges, 91,000 artillery shells, 6,700 tons of leftover war, equal to a third of the Hiroshima bomb. They wired it all into one single network. They set off a small charge first, just to scare the birds away. And then, on the fourth pip of the BBC's 1 o'clock time signal, broadcast live on the radio so the whole world could hear it, a British engineer pressed a button. The mushroom cloud rose 1,500 meters into the sky. The shock wave was felt 70 kilometers away on the German coast. People in Sicily, 2,000 kilometers south, registered the tremor on their instruments. It is to this day the largest planned non-nuclear explosion in human history. They expected the entire island to vanish into the sea, but it didn't. The red sandstone, 200 million years old, simply absorbed the blow. The southern tip caved in. A new crater opened up. The shape of the island changed forever. But Helgoland survived. Of course it survived. For the next 5 years, the British used the wreckage as a bombing range. Day after day, plane after plane. The Helgolanders, scattered across the mainland, listened to the news on the radio and wept. They thought they were never going home. And then came the bravest thing anyone ever did for this island. On the 20th of December 1950, just before Christmas, 2 students and a professor from Heidelberg sailed out to the Forbidden Island in a tiny boat. They climbed up onto the rocks, and they raised the German flag, and the flag of Helgoland itself, which hadn't flown for 10 years. The British arrested them within hours, but it was too late. The photograph was already in every newspaper in Germany, and the country went mad. Petitions were signed, the Bundestag voted. And on the 1st of March 1952, after 7 years of silence, the British finally handed Helgoland back. The islanders came home to a wasteland. A boy called Olaf Olsen was 11 years old when he stepped off the ferry that morning. He was supposed to lay flowers on his grandfather's grave. He couldn't find it. He couldn't even find the church. He told a reporter, 60 years later, that he just stood there in the rubble and cried. But here's the part that breaks me. They rebuilt it. Again, they cleared the unexploded shells with their bare hands. They painted the new houses in the bright colors they remembered from, before the war, the reds and the yellows and the blues, because they refused to live in a gray place. And when they walked up onto the Oberland, the high plateau where their grandparents had walked, they found that one thing had survived, a single mulberry tree, battered, twisted, half-burnt, still alive. The Helgolanders today still call it the miracle of Helgoland, and every spring it still gives fruit. There is one more thing I have to tell you about this island, because if I don't, I will have failed you. In June of 1925, a 23-year-old physicist called Werner Heisenberg came to Helgoland. He was sick, hay fever so bad he couldn't think. His professor gave him 2 weeks off. He chose Helgoland because there is no pollen on a rock in the middle of the sea. And here, climbing the same paths, the Frisian fishermen had walked for 1,000 years, reading Goethe at night, watching the sun rise over the North Sea. Heisenberg had the idea that became quantum mechanics, the way we understand atoms, the way we understand reality itself. At 3 o'clock one morning, in a little rented room on this island, he worked it out on paper. He said later he was so excited he couldn't sleep. He climbed up to the top of the cliffs and waited for the dawn. Just think about that. The way humans understand the universe was born on the same rock where Frisian fishermen once prayed to a god called Fosite, where a banished poet wrote the German national anthem, where birds were watched until they became science, where the largest non-nuclear explosion in history failed to kill an island that simply refused to die. Today, about 1,300 people live on this rock. No cars. No taxes, a quiet echo of the smuggling days. The bunkers underneath are open to visitors now. The bird observatory is still going, run by the great-grandchildren of the people Heinrich Gatke knew. The Lang Anna sea stack still stands on the northwest tip, even though the sea is slowly eating away at its base, and one day, probably in our lifetime, it will fall too. But when you stand on the Oberland and you look out, you can see all of it at once. The bomb craters, the crumbling piers from a war that was never finished, the red cliffs that survived every single thing humans ever threw at them, the mulberry tree, and the birds, the millions of birds that pass over this rock every spring and every autumn, just as they did 1,000 years ago, before any of us were here. Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest stories. And this little red rock holds more than almost anywhere I've ever read about. It has been Danish and British and German. It has been holy and lawless and free and bombed flat and reborn. And every single time the world tried to take it away, the people of Helgoland came home and built it again. If you've ever been to Helgoland or know someone who lived through what happened there, let me know in the comments. And let me know where I should go next. See you in the next one.